Hello and welcome to the Whispering Worlds channel. What would you do if your world fell apart with a single text message? You're invited to immerse yourself in the lives of Evan and Naomi as they navigate betrayal, heartbreak, and the search for forgiveness. This isn't just their story, it's yours too. What choices would you make? Could you forgive? Could you rebuild what's been lost? Or would you walk away? Join the journey and share your thoughts. Should love triumph over betrayal? Or is it sometimes better to let go? It began subtly, as many betrayals do. Little signs, barely noticeable to the untrained eye. Evan Ralston had always prided himself on being observant. It was a skill honed during years of meticulous work as a software consultant. Yet, when it came to his wife, Naomi, he had ignored the warning signs. Evan sat at the kitchen table, staring at his phone. The pale glow illuminated a text message that had been eating away at him for days. It wasn't directed at him, but rather a remnant left on Naomi's screen after she had fallen asleep on the couch 2 nights prior. Tonight was incredible. Can't wait for the next time, beautiful. L. He had scrolled through the thread that night, his hands trembling. It was all there. Plans for dinners, inside jokes he didn't understand, and confessions of feelings that went far beyond professional camaraderie. The messages were from a young man named Lucas, one of Naomi's colleagues at the marketing firm where she worked. Evan clenched his fists, the pain in his chest intensifying as he replayed the words over and over. Naomi arrived home late that evening, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Evan watched her from the living room, the way she dropped her bag by the door and sighed as if the weight of the world was on her shoulders. "Long day?" he asked, his voice calm, almost detached. She hesitated before answering. "Yeah, we had a big client pitch today. Went over well, though." Her tone was breezy, but Evan caught the flicker of unease in her eyes. He wanted to confront her then and there, to demand an explanation. But he held back. He needed time to gather his thoughts and decide his next move. "That's good," he said finally, forcing a smile. "I'm glad it went well." Naomi nodded and disappeared upstairs to change. Evan listened to the sound of the shower running, his mind racing. The next morning, Evan woke early, determined to push aside the turmoil and focus on work. But the messages lingered in his mind like a shadow, dark and persistent. At his office downtown, he went through the motions of the day, answering emails, attending meetings, but everything felt hollow. During lunch, he confided in his close friend and coworker, James. "I found something on Naomi's phone." Evan began hesitantly, picking at the edges of his sandwich. James raised an eyebrow. "Something? Messages? From another guy?" The words hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. James leaned forward, his expression serious. "Are you sure it's what you think?" "I'm sure," Evan said bitterly. "It's not just the messages. She's been different lately, distant, staying late at work more often than not. It all lines up." James sighed, setting his coffee down. "That's tough, man. What are you going to do?" Evan shook his head. "I don't know yet, but I can't ignore it." That evening, Evan decided to confront Naomi. He waited until after dinner, when they were sitting in the living room. The television played softly in the background, but neither of them was paying attention. "Naomi," he began, his voice steady but firm. "We need to talk." She looked up from her phone, her expression cautious. "What about?" Evan took a deep breath. "I know about Lucas." The color drained from her face, and for a moment, she said nothing. Then she laughed nervously, a sound that grated against his nerves. "Lucas? He's just a friend from work. What are you talking about?" "I saw the messages," Evan said bluntly. "Don't lie to me." Her demeanor shifted instantly. She set her phone down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Evan, it's not what you think," she began, but the hesitation in her voice betrayed her. "Then what is it?" he pressed, his voice rising. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks a hell of a lot like you've been cheating on me." Naomi's eyes filled with tears, but Evan felt no sympathy. Instead, he felt anger and betrayal coursing through him. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she admitted finally. her voice barely above a whisper. It started as a friendship. I was feeling lonely. We've been so distant lately, Evan. I didn't know how to fix it. So you turned to someone else? He snapped. That's your solution? I made a mistake, she said, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, Evan. I really am. But her apology did nothing to ease the pain. Evan stood, his hands trembling with emotion. I need time to think, he said stiffly. I'm going to stay with James tonight. Naomi didn't try to stop him. As he packed a bag and left the house, Evan felt a mixture of relief and anguish. The life he had built with Naomi was crumbling, and he had no idea how to piece it back together. As he drove through the city, the lights of the skyline blurred by his tears, Evan made a silent vow. Whatever came next, he would face it head-on. He didn't know if his marriage could be saved or if he even wanted to save it. But one thing was clear. His life would never be the same. Naomi sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. The open-plan office buzzed with activity, but the noise barely registered. She had slept poorly, tossing and turning as the memory of Evan's confrontation replayed in her mind. Her chest tightened as she glanced toward the corner of the room where Lucas's desk was. He wasn't there, but even his absence felt oppressive. She had tried to bury herself in work that morning, but productivity proved elusive. Every so often, she caught a coworker's lingering glance, followed by a whispered exchange. The office wasn't large enough to hide secrets for long. Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that people knew, or at least suspected. Her closest friend at work, Danielle, approached her desk with a steaming mug. Here, Danielle said, setting it down. You look like you need this. Thanks, Naomi said, managing a faint smile. Danielle leaned on the edge of the desk, crossing her arms. Everything okay? You've been kind of off lately. Naomi hesitated. Danielle's tone was kind, but Naomi couldn't help but hear the hint of curiosity beneath it. Just a rough patch at home, she said carefully. Danielle raised an eyebrow. Anything you want to talk about? Not really. Just stuff, Naomi replied, hoping to close the door on the subject. But Danielle didn't move. You know, Danielle said, lowering her voice, people talk about you and Lucas. Naomi's stomach dropped. What are they saying? Danielle shrugged. That you two seem close. Maybe too close. I don't know if it's true, but you should be careful. Office gossip is brutal. Naomi's mind raced. She tried to muster a response but found herself nodding mutely instead. Danielle's concern was genuine, but it only deepened the pit in Naomi's stomach. Thanks, she said softly. I'll keep that in mind. As Danielle walked away, Naomi's gaze drifted to Lucas's empty desk again. She couldn't shake the sense that her world was closing in on her. Later that afternoon, Lucas finally arrived. He strode in with his usual confidence, flashing smiles at coworkers as he passed. When he reached Naomi's desk, he paused. Hey, he said quietly. Can we talk? She glanced around nervously. Not here. The break room, he suggested. She nodded reluctantly and followed him. Once inside, Lucas closed the door, and Naomi crossed her arms, leaning against the counter. Evan knows, she said before he could speak. Lucas's expression faltered. What? How? He found the messages, Naomi said, her voice shaking. We argued last night. He's staying with a friend. Lucas ran a hand through his hair, his confidence visibly waning. Damn. I didn't think he. Of course he did, Naomi snapped. It was reckless, Lucas. All of it. I didn't mean for this to happen, he said. I care about you. Naomi closed her eyes, the weight of his words adding to her turmoil. This can't keep happening, she said firmly. It's over. Naomi. Come on, Lucas pleaded. We have something real. Don't just throw it away. It's already gone, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Lucas could respond, the door opened, and a coworker walked in. Naomi stepped away from Lucas quickly, her face burning with embarrassment. The coworker glanced between them but said nothing, retrieving a cup of coffee before leaving again. Lucas sighed. "We should talk later." "There's nothing left to say," Naomi replied before walking out. That evening, Naomi sat alone in her car in the office parking lot, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her face looked pale and drawn, a stark contrast to the confident woman she used to be. She pulled out her phone and stared at Evan's number. She wanted to call him, to explain, to apologize again. But what could she say that he hadn't already heard? Rain began to fall, pattering softly against the windshield. Naomi set her phone aside and rested her head against the steering wheel. She felt trapped, by her choices, by her guilt, and by the growing realization that she had no idea how to fix the damage she had caused. Evan leaned against the railing of James's apartment balcony, staring at the sprawling city skyline. The lights twinkled in the distance, their brightness a sharp contrast to the darkness that consumed him. He gripped a glass of whiskey, the warmth of the liquid doing little to ease the ache in his chest. Behind him, James's voice cut through the silence. "You're going to catch a cold out here, man." Evan turned slightly but didn't respond. James stepped onto the balcony, holding a blanket, which he tossed over Evan's shoulders. "Look, I know you're hurting, but this isn't going to help." "I know," Evan said quietly, "but I can't stop thinking about it. About her." James leaned against the railing beside him. "It's only been a couple of days. You need to give yourself time." Evan shook his head, his jaw tightening. "How am I supposed to give it time? She betrayed me. She looked me in the eye and lied. How do I move past that?" James sighed. "You don't, not really. But you figure out how to live with it, whether that's by fixing things or walking away. Only you can decide what's right for you." Evan didn't reply. Instead, he stared out at the city, the weight of James's words pressing down on him. The next morning, Evan decided to take a break from his usual routine. He called his boss and asked for the day off, then grabbed his car keys and drove aimlessly through the city. The roads were surprisingly quiet, allowing him to get lost in his thoughts. Eventually, he found himself at the park where he and Naomi used to take their dog, Max, on long walks. The memories of those days, filled with laughter and easy conversation, felt like they belonged to someone else's life. Evan parked and stepped out, the crisp morning air biting at his skin. He walked down the familiar path, past the bench where they used to sit. He stopped there, staring at the spot where they had shared so many moments. A group of children played nearby, their laughter ringing out. For a moment, he envied their innocence, their freedom from the complexities of adult relationships. He sat down on the bench, pulling out his phone. Naomi's name stared back at him from the call log. He thought about calling her, but what would he say? He wanted answers, but he wasn't sure he was ready to hear them. Instead, he put the phone away and leaned back, closing his eyes. That evening, Evan returned to James's apartment, his thoughts still tangled. James was waiting for him in the living room, a beer in hand. "Feel any better?" James asked. Evan shrugged. "Not really, but I've been thinking about something." "Yeah, I think I need space. Not just from Naomi, but from all of this." Evan gestured vaguely, as though the city itself was part of the problem. "Maybe a fresh start is what I need." James studied him for a moment before nodding. "If that's what you feel, then do it. Sometimes, the best way to heal is to put some distance between you and the pain." Evan exhaled, a faint sense of relief washing over him. For the first time since discovering the messages, he felt like he had a direction, even if it was just a step toward clarity. Later that night, as he lay on the couch in James's spare room, Evan stared at the ceiling. His mind drifted back to Naomi, to her tears and the apology she had offered. He didn't know if he could forgive her, but he knew he couldn't keep drowning in the pain. Tomorrow he would start planning. Whether it was a new job, a new city, or just time away, Evan was ready to take control of his life again. Naomi sat on the edge of her bed, the house eerily quiet without Evan's presence. The walls seemed to close in on her, the silence amplifying her thoughts. The life she had shared with Evan felt fragile, like a glass that had slipped from her hands and shattered. She stared at the empty side of the bed, her guilt and regret weighing her down. She picked up her phone and opened her messages. Her last conversation with Evan was still there, his terse words replaying in her mind. "I can't do this right now. I need space." She had read it over a dozen times, searching for some glimmer of hope that he might come back. Her phone buzzed with a new message. For a brief moment, her heart leaped, thinking it was Evan. But it wasn't. "Lucas, we should talk. I miss you." Naomi's chest tightened. She didn't reply. She couldn't. Things with Lucas had been a mistake. A reckless, selfish attempt to fill a void she hadn't even realized was growing until it consumed her marriage. Whatever connection they'd had was tainted now, and she wanted no part of it. She tossed the phone onto the bed and buried her face in her hands. The tears came quickly, and for a moment, she let them flow. But crying wouldn't fix this. She needed to figure out what she wanted and how to make amends, if she even could. Later that day, Naomi decided to visit her friend Claire, someone she hadn't seen in weeks. Claire had been her confidant in the past, the person she turned to when life felt overwhelming. She wasn't sure if she was ready to explain everything, but she needed the comfort of a familiar face. Claire greeted her warmly at the door, her arms pulling Naomi into a tight hug. "It's been too long," Claire said, leading her inside. "You look exhausted." Naomi managed a weak smile. "That's one way to put it." They sat in the living room, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. Naomi wrapped her hands around the warm mug, staring into the liquid as though it held the answers she was searching for. "Talk to me," Claire said gently. "What's going on?" Naomi hesitated, the words sticking in her throat. But as she looked at Claire's kind expression, the dam broke. She told her everything. About the distance between her and Evan, about Lucas, and about the confrontation that had upended her life. When she finished, Claire sat back, her face a mixture of shock and sadness. "Naomi, what were you thinking?" "I wasn't," Naomi admitted, her voice cracking. "I was lonely. I felt like Evan and I were drifting apart, and Lucas, he made me feel seen. But it was a mistake, and now I don't know how to fix it." Claire reached across the table and took Naomi's hand. "You can't undo what's happened, but you can take responsibility for it. You need to be honest with yourself about what you want. Do you still love Evan?" Naomi nodded quickly. "Of course I do, but I don't know if he'll ever forgive me." "That's something only time can answer," Claire said. "But if you want any chance of repairing things, you need to start by being completely honest with him. No more secrets. No more excuses." Naomi nodded, her resolve hardening. Claire was right. She had spent too long running from her mistakes, hoping they would somehow resolve themselves. It was time to face them head-on, no matter how painful it might be. That evening, Naomi sat down at the dining table with a pen and a notebook. Writing wasn't her strength, but she needed to sort through her thoughts. She began drafting a letter to Evan, pouring out her feelings and taking responsibility for what she had done. She wrote about the loneliness she had felt, her regrets, and her hope that, someday, he might find it in his heart to forgive her. When she finished, she folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. She wasn't sure if she would send it yet, but for the first time in days, she felt a small sense of clarity. Naomi placed the envelope on the counter and looked around the empty house. It didn't feel like home anymore. Without Evan, it was just a shell, a reminder of everything she had lost. But she wasn't ready to give up, on the house, on her marriage, or on herself. Evan stood at the window of a modest apartment in Portland, watching the rain drizzle against the glass. The move had been impulsive but necessary. Leaving behind his job, his friends, and the city he had called home was the only way he felt he could breathe again. Portland offered anonymity, a chance to rebuild without the constant reminders of his shattered marriage. The apartment was sparse. Just a couch, a bed, and a small dining table he had assembled himself. It wasn't much, but it was his. For the first time in years, Evan felt a small sense of control. He had spent the last week familiarizing himself with his new surroundings. His days were filled with job interviews and exploring the city's coffee shops and bookstores. He avoided his phone, unwilling to face the missed calls and messages from Naomi. He needed distance, and so far it was working. One afternoon, Evan found himself at a small cafe tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. The warm aroma of coffee and baked goods filled the air, a comforting escape from the rain outside. He opened his laptop and began drafting a cover letter for a software position he had found online. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" a soft voice asked. Evan looked up to see a woman with curly brown hair and a friendly smile. She gestured to the chair across from him. "Everywhere else is full." He shook his head. "No, go ahead." She sat down, placing a book and a steaming cup of tea on the table. Evan returned to his laptop, but her presence was strangely calming. After a few minutes of silence, she spoke again. "Job hunting?" "Yeah," Evan replied, glancing up. "Just moved here, trying to get settled." She smiled sympathetically. "That's brave. Starting over is hard, but it's also exciting." "Exciting isn't exactly how I describe it," Evan said, a hint of humor in his tone. She laughed lightly. "Fair enough. I'm Lily, by the way." "Evan." For the next hour, they exchanged stories. Lily was a freelance graphic designer who had moved to Portland a year ago after leaving a toxic work environment. Her openness and warmth were refreshing, and for the first time in weeks, Evan found himself smiling. As they parted ways, she handed him her business card. "If you need recommendations for places to check out, give me a call." Evan took the card, tucking it into his pocket. "Thanks, Lily." That evening, as Evan sat in his apartment, he thought about their conversation. It wasn't romantic. He wasn't ready for that. But it reminded him that life could still hold unexpected moments of connection. It was a small step forward, but it felt significant. He glanced at his phone, debating whether to check his messages. When he finally opened it, there were several missed calls from Naomi and a single text. "I wrote you a letter. Please read it when you're ready." Evan stared at the message, his emotions churning. He wasn't sure if he was ready to hear what she had to say, but curiosity tugged at him. He typed a brief reply, "You can send it." 2 days later, the envelope arrived. Evan sat at the dining table, the letter trembling in his hands. He opened it slowly, the sound of tearing paper deafening in the quiet apartment. Naomi's handwriting was neat and precise, the words carefully chosen. She wrote about her regret, her loneliness, and her mistakes. She admitted to feeling neglected but took full responsibility for the choices she had made. She didn't ask for forgiveness, only the chance to someday explain herself in person. The letter ended with a simple line, "I still love you, and I hope you can find happiness, even if it's not with me." Evan set the letter down, his chest tight. He appreciated her honesty, but the pain was still raw. He wasn't sure if he could ever forgive her, but a small part of him respected her effort to take accountability. That night, he sat on the balcony, the letter resting on the table beside him. The city lights flickered in the distance, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope, not for his marriage, but for his future. Naomi sat in her living room, staring at her phone. The silence in the house felt oppressive, amplifying every small creak and distant noise. She had sent the letter days ago, and though she had no right to expect a reply, the waiting gnawed at her. She sipped from a mug of tea, the warmth doing little to calm her nerves. Her phone buzzed suddenly, startling her. She snatched it up, her heart pounding. It was a message from Evan. "Got your letter. Thank you for your honesty. I need time, but I appreciate you taking responsibility." Naomi stared at the screen, her eyes filling with tears. It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't rejection either. It was something, a thread of hope. Evan had reread Naomi's letter several times, each pass leaving him with conflicting emotions. He admired her courage in admitting her mistakes, but the pain of betrayal was still fresh. After days of reflection, he decided he needed to talk to her, not to reconcile but to find closure. He called her that evening. She answered on the first ring. "Evan." Her voice was tentative, unsure. "Naomi, I got your letter," he said, his tone even. "Thank you for writing it." There was a long pause before she responded. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to hear from me. I didn't at first, he admitted. But I think we need to talk. In person. Naomi's breath caught. I'd like that. When? I'll be in town next weekend, Evan said. We can meet then. Okay, she said softly. I'll see you then. The following Saturday, Evan walked into the cafe where they had agreed to meet. It was a place they had frequented early in their marriage, back when their weekends were filled with leisurely breakfasts and shared laughter. Seeing Naomi sitting at a corner table brought a flood of memories, both good and bad. She looked up as he approached, her face pale but determined. Hi, she said. Hi. He sat across from her, the tension between them palpable. The waitress arrived, breaking the silence. They ordered coffees, and once she left, Evan leaned forward, clasping his hands together. I want to be honest with you, he began. Reading your letter meant a lot, but it doesn't erase what happened. Naomi nodded, her eyes glistening. I know. I don't expect it to. I needed you to know how sorry I am. I believe you, Evan said. But trust isn't something I can give back overnight. What you did hurt me more than I can put into words. Naomi swallowed hard. I never wanted to hurt you, Evan. I was selfish and reckless, and I let my own insecurities push me into something I regret more than anything. Evan studied her for a moment. Why didn't you tell me you felt that way? That you were lonely or unhappy? I didn't know how, she admitted, and I didn't want to make things worse. I thought I could fix it on my own, but instead, I made everything worse. The coffees arrived, and they both paused, taking sips as the conversation lingered in the air. Finally, Evan broke the silence. Naomi, I don't know if we can fix this, he said honestly. But I know I don't want to live in anger forever. I need time to figure out what that means, for both of us. Naomi nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. I understand, and I'll respect whatever you decide. They sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of their history hanging between them. As Evan left the cafe, he felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The path ahead was still uncertain, but at least now he had begun to take the first steps. Evan returned to Portland feeling emotionally drained but oddly lighter. The conversation with Naomi had been painful, but it had also allowed him to release some of the anger he had been holding on to. Though their future remained uncertain, he no longer felt paralyzed by the weight of the past. In the days that followed, Evan immersed himself in his new routine. He had secured a job at a mid-sized tech firm and was slowly settling into the rhythms of his new life. Evenings were often spent at local bookstores or cafes, and occasionally, he found himself thinking about Naomi. Not with bitterness, but with a wistful sense of what might have been. One evening, as he sat at a cafe reading, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Naomi. Naomi, thank you for meeting with me. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I hope we can stay in touch, even if it's just as friends. Evan stared at the message for a long moment, conflicted. He wasn't sure if friendship was possible, but he didn't want to shut her out entirely. After some thought, he replied, Evan, I need time to figure out what this means for us. I'm not ready to jump into anything, but we can stay in touch. Her reply came quickly. Naomi, that's all I can ask. Thank you. Meanwhile, Naomi was navigating her own journey of self-reflection. The conversation with Evan had reinforced her determination to change. Not just for him, but for herself. She started therapy, delving into the insecurities and patterns that had led to her mistakes. The process was difficult, forcing her to confront uncomfortable truths, but she welcomed the challenge. She also distanced herself from Lucas. After their last interaction, she had made it clear that there was no future for them. Lucas had tried to reach out a few times, but Naomi ignored his messages. She knew that maintaining any connection with him would only hinder her efforts to rebuild her life. At work, she kept her head down, focusing on her responsibilities and avoiding office gossip. Danielle remained a supportive presence, offering a listening ear when Naomi needed it. Though the road ahead felt daunting, Naomi took comfort in knowing she was taking steps toward becoming a better version of herself. One rainy afternoon, Evan received an unexpected call. It was from Lily, the graphic designer he had met at the cafe weeks earlier. "Hey, Evan," she said brightly. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all," Evan replied, surprised but pleased to hear from her. "I was wondering if you'd like to join me and a few friends for dinner tomorrow night. Just a casual thing, we're trying out this new Thai place." Evan hesitated for a moment, unsure if he was ready to dive into socializing. But something about Lily's easygoing demeanor made him want to say yes. "That sounds great," he said finally. "Count me in." "Perfect. I'll text you the details," Lily said. As he hung up, Evan felt a flicker of excitement. It wasn't a date and he wasn't looking for one, but the idea of connecting with new people felt like a step forward. The dinner was lively and relaxed, filled with laughter and good food. Lily's friends were warm and welcoming, and Evan found himself enjoying the evening more than he had expected. He shared stories of his move to Portland and listened to theirs, relishing the simple pleasure of human connection. As the group said their goodbyes, Lily lingered for a moment. "I'm glad you came," she said. "You seemed like you needed this." "I did," Evan admitted. "Thanks for inviting me." She smiled. "Anytime. And hey, if you ever want to grab coffee or just hang out, let me know. I'll take you up on that," Evan said, meaning it. That night, as he walked back to his apartment, Evan felt a sense of hope he hadn't experienced in months. Life was far from perfect, and the scars of his past still lingered, but for the first time he saw the possibility of healing. Not just for himself, but for the relationships he chose to nurture moving forward. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of Evan's new life in Portland began to feel normal. He still thought about Naomi often, but the intensity of those thoughts had softened. Their occasional texts were civil, even friendly, but they were careful not to dive too deeply into unresolved emotions. Both seemed to understand that time was their ally now. One evening, as Evan was preparing dinner, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen and saw Naomi's name. Surprised, he hesitated before answering. "Hey," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "Hi, Evan," Naomi replied. Her voice was steady but carried a nervous edge. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "No, it's fine. What's up?" There was a pause before she continued. "I've been thinking a lot about us. About everything. I know you said you needed time and I don't want to pressure you, but would you consider meeting again? Just to talk?" Evan leaned against the counter, considering her request. He had mixed feelings about reopening that door, but he also felt a lingering curiosity about what she had to say. "Okay," he said finally, "but I want to set some boundaries. I'm still figuring things out, and I don't want to make any promises." "I understand," Naomi said quickly. "That's all I can ask." "Thank you." They agreed to meet the following weekend at a neutral location, a quiet park halfway between their old house and Portland. As Evan arrived, he spotted Naomi sitting on a bench under a canopy of trees. She looked up and offered a small, hesitant smile as he approached. "Hi," she said softly. "Hi." They sat in silence for a few moments, the sounds of rustling leaves and distant laughter filling the space between them. Finally, Naomi spoke. "I've been in therapy," she said. "I started a few weeks after you left. It's been eye-opening." Evan raised an eyebrow. "Really?" She nodded. "I've been learning a lot about myself, about the patterns and insecurities that led me to what I did. It doesn't excuse anything, but it's helping me understand how I got to that point." Evan crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to know that I'm working on myself," she said earnestly. "Not to win you back, but because I need to be better, for myself and for anyone I care about." Evan studied her for a long moment. There was a sincerity in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. "I'm glad you're doing that," he said finally. "It sounds like a good step." They continued talking, this time about their shared history. Naomi apologized again, this time with more depth, taking full responsibility for her actions without deflecting or making excuses. Evan listened, nodding occasionally, but he didn't offer forgiveness, not yet. As the sun began to set, they walked back to their cars. Before parting ways, Naomi turned to Evan. I know we can't go back to the way things were, she said. But I hope someday we can rebuild something, whether it's as friends or whatever feels right. Evan considered her words carefully. Maybe, he said, but it's going to take time. And trust. I understand, she said. Thank you for giving me the chance to say all of this. As they drove away in opposite directions, Evan felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, sadness, and a faint glimmer of hope. He still wasn't sure what the future held, but he was beginning to see that healing didn't have to be a solitary journey. Evan's life continued to evolve in Portland. His new job provided a steady rhythm, and his evenings were increasingly filled with small joys. Exploring the city's food scene, attending a photography class he had impulsively signed up for, and building friendships with people like Lily. While his relationship with Naomi was still in a state of cautious rebuilding, he was also finding ways to move forward independently. One Saturday, as he was sorting through a box of old belongings he had brought from the house, Evan came across a photo album. The pictures were a mix of moments: holidays, lazy Sundays, and snapshots of Max, their dog. He lingered on a photo of him and Naomi, taken during a road trip to the coast. They looked so happy, their arms around each other as they stood on a windswept beach. The image stirred a bittersweet ache in his chest. He had been so certain of their love back then, so sure they could weather any storm. Now, he wasn't sure what their future held, but the memory of that connection gave him pause. Meanwhile, Naomi was making strides of her own. Therapy had become a cornerstone of her life, helping her unpack the insecurities that had led to her betrayal. She had also started volunteering at a local animal shelter, finding solace in caring for creatures that needed love and attention. It wasn't much, but it felt like progress. One evening, as she was leaving the shelter, she received a text from Evan. "Can we talk?" Her heart leaped into her throat. She typed a quick reply, of course. When? They agreed to meet the next day at a cafe near the park where they had last spoken. Naomi arrived early, nervous but hopeful. When Evan walked in, he looked more relaxed than she had seen him in months. There was a quiet confidence in the way he carried himself that she hadn't noticed before. "Hi," she said, standing as he approached. "Hi," he replied, sitting across from her. After ordering their drinks, they settled into conversation. Evan spoke first. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said. "About us. About everything that happened." Naomi nodded, bracing herself for his next words. "I don't know if we can ever get back to what we had," he continued. "But I also don't think I want to shut the door on us completely. There was a time when we were really good together, and I think it's worth seeing if we can find that again, even if it's different." Tears welled in Naomi's eyes. "I don't know what to say, Evan, except thank you for even considering it. I'm not making any promises," he said firmly. "This has to be a process, one step at a time. And it has to be about rebuilding trust, not just pretending everything is okay." "I understand," she said, her voice steady. "And I'm willing to do whatever it takes." They spent the next hour talking about boundaries, expectations, and what healing might look like for them. Evan was clear that he needed to take things slowly, and Naomi assured him she was committed to earning his trust back, no matter how long it took. That night, Evan reflected on their conversation. It felt like a cautious step forward, a bridge between the pain of the past and the possibility of a new beginning. He wasn't sure where the path would lead, but he was willing to take it, one careful step at a time. Months passed, and the dynamic between Evan and Naomi shifted slowly, cautiously. They began to meet more regularly, sometimes for coffee, other times for walks in the park or dinners at familiar places that carried echoes of their past. Their conversations grew deeper, marked by vulnerability and an openness that had been absent for years. But even as they built a tentative connection, Evan couldn't ignore the lingering scars. One evening, they sat together on a park bench, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the path. Evan turned to Naomi, his expression thoughtful. "We've come a long way," he said, "but I think we need to be honest about where we're headed." Naomi nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I've been thinking about that too." Evan exhaled deeply. I care about you, Naomi. I always will. But I don't think we can go back to being husband and wife. Too much has changed. I've changed. Naomi's breath hitched, but she didn't cry. She had prepared herself for this possibility. I understand, she said softly, and I respect your decision. I hope you know how much I've appreciated this time we've had, even if it's not the ending I hoped for. Evan placed a hand over hers. It's not about ending badly. It's about ending honestly. I think we both needed this to heal, and I'm grateful for that. They sat in silence, the weight of the moment settling between them. It was painful, but there was also a sense of closure, a mutual acknowledgement that their love, while real, had run its course. In the weeks that followed, Evan finalized the divorce, a process that was surprisingly amicable given their history. Naomi continued her therapy and her work at the animal shelter, finding solace in rebuilding her life on her own terms. They kept in touch occasionally, exchanging brief updates or kind words, but they both knew that maintaining distance was necessary for them to truly move forward. Evan focused on his new life in Portland. He threw himself into his work, deepened his friendships, and even began exploring photography more seriously. One day, while reviewing shots from a weekend hike, he realized how much lighter he felt, freer, as if the weight of his past had finally lifted. Lily remained a steady presence in his life, her friendship a source of comfort and inspiration. Over time, their connection deepened, though Evan was careful not to rush into anything. He had learned the value of patience and self-awareness, and he wanted to approach the future with intention. For Naomi, the journey was different but equally transformative. She had learned to forgive herself, a process that had been harder than she imagined. She discovered a new sense of purpose through her work with the shelter and began to find joy in the simple things. A sunny afternoon, a quiet evening with a book, a friendly smile from a stranger. One day, while walking through the park, she came across a family playing with a golden retriever. She smiled, her heart swelling with warmth. She had learned that love could take many forms, and while she had lost one version of it, she still believed in its power to heal and connect. Years later, Evan and Naomi crossed paths unexpectedly at a bookstore. They exchanged smiles and a brief hug, their conversation warm but brief. There was no tension, no bitterness, only mutual respect and a quiet acknowledgement of the roles they had played in each other's lives. As they parted ways, Evan felt a sense of peace. Life had taken them in different directions, but it had also taught them resilience, forgiveness, and the importance of moving forward. For both of them, the ending wasn't what they had once dreamed of, but it was honest, and it was theirs, a bittersweet resolution to a chapter of their lives that had shaped them forever. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.